My guest today is Professor of Marketing, Annetta Grant. She is currently the Assistant Professor of Markets, Innovations, and Design at Bucknell University, and author of a paper that was published in the Journal of Consumer Research entitled Displacement and the Professionalization of the Home. She's been featured on All Things Considered, one of my favorite NPR shows, as well as The Atlantic, The Washington Post, and House Digest. We're going to talk about Annette's research today. It is so applicable to the slow style approach, and I think it's going to give us some real clarity on how we got to where we are today, why you may be feeling frustrated that your decorating projects have failed, or why you are dissatisfied with them, why you are so overwhelmed with choices, why you feel like you don't know what you're doing or you don't know what you like. And we're going to challenge all of that today. Annetta, welcome to the Slow Style Home Podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, Sandra.
So I want to just start with the basic premise of your research. Tell us what it is you were interested in learning more about and giving some sort of quantitative and qualitative data to back up your hypothesis.
What I was really curious about was understanding how people choose to spend money on their homes. And we'll back it up even a step behind to say, curious about how people spend their money.
Okay.
And so what I had been witnessing was that people were replacing a 5 or a 10-year-old kitchen to put in a new one. And what I was really curious about was why, in some cases, were people choosing to spend 20 or 30 or even 50 or $100,000 on a kitchen or bathroom that seemed pretty functional already, when they could be choosing to spend that money on early retirement or vacations with their friends and family or their children's education. What was really the driving force behind them spending money on the home in that way? And what was it in particular about the home
Yeah.
that made that such a priority? And so that's really where my curiosity began.
And then you kind of took us back to World War II and what was the ethos or the cultural norms around the home? And then tell us a little bit, just kind of get us started with the shift that started to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you think about the time post World War II, this was a time when suburban America was really being born. A lot of new homes were being built, and a lot of people were moving into their first home for the first time. And really, at that time, if we understand what the meaning of the home was meant to be, it was meant to be a place for you and your family. And it was meant to be really a reflection of who you were and who your family was. And so if you look back at homes of that time, or if you look back at ads from that time, what you'll see is that there was a great push for people to express their own identities in their homes through bright colors. Right. So this is where we think back to kitchens with avocado green refrigerators or yellow ovens or a pink theme. People were really encouraged to express their individual identities through those bright, bold colors and in a very individual kind of way. Now, if we fast forward to today, what's changed is the way that we see the home. And so, really, what we found in our research is that people look to home renovations media. So, what I'm talking about here, HGTV shows, magazines, social media, and that changes how they view their own homes. And increasingly, a lot of these media outlets have made the home more of a financial asset to be maximized. And so what happens is that people today do renovations with an eye to what does everyone else want and not necessarily what they want. And as a result, what we found is that really homeowners feel uneasy in their own homes.
Yeah. So that's one aspect of it. It is our biggest financial asset. So I get that. I get why that is so appealing. What's interesting about your research, and certainly what I have felt and observed in my own life and working with hundreds of people, just regular homeowners, is this trickle down effect where this idea of a financial asset is stripping away the personalization. And so you talk about two ideas, displacement
Yeah.
and emplacement.
Yeah.
And when you
So
say displacement, I just want to say you spell it with a Y, DYS. So kind of explain those two phenomenon, if you will.
yeah, absolutely. So what we explored was this idea of emplacement. When people use the expression, oh, I felt so at home,
Hmm.
you might feel that if you're looking for an apartment or you're actually searching for a home, you kind of walk in and people will describe having this immediate feeling of, oh, I felt so at home. And so that really captures the essence of this idea of emplacement. It really feels like you kind of belong there.
Mm.
And so, what we understand through sociology is that people really crave that. And the home really becomes the quintessential site for where people want to feel at ease. And the way that you felt at home was because it was a reflection of who you were and who your family was. Now, what's shifted is that media and marketing are telling us a different story about the home. They're telling us today that your home should really meet marketplace standards.
Mhm.
And what I mean by marketplace standards are typical things you'll see in magazines or on these HGTV shows. For now, those markers of standardization tend to be white or gray walls, granite countertops, industrial style appliances, spa-like bathrooms. All of these places that we see on media are really created with neutral colors. They almost become a kind of a blank slate. And so in some ways, they're really created for everybody, but at the same time, they're created for no one.
Mhm.
And
Mhm.
so what ends up happening is that we have these long held beliefs that the home should be a place for us that where we feel in place, where we feel at home because it's a reflection of who we are. And now all of a sudden, though, we have media telling us, but wait a minute, your home really needs to adhere to these standards. And if they're not adhering to the standards, your home is not going to be worth any money. You know, you're losing your financial asset. And so what
Or you mentioned people kind of, you'll be embarrassed to have people over if you don't meet standards, or you're always going to be constantly thinking like, oh, but what if somebody thinks that my choice is wrong or not chic enough or whatever.
Exactly, right? And so what ends up happening is that people renovate their homes to these marketplace standards, which strips out all of that personalization. And then they don't have that feeling of feeling at home.
Yeah.
They don't have that feeling of being in place or feeling in placement. And what instead they feel is this feeling of unease, of not really being at home, and they could actually be in a hotel room or an airport lounge, and that idea of displacement spelled with a Y captures that idea of kind of feeling like you're in no place.
Yes. And you contextualize this for us in the beginning of the paper when corporations come in and they kind of take over a neighborhood and then everything starts to feel a bit more, I would say, generic because it's the same stores you'd see in anywhere USA. And so that's why the sense of place is stripped out. It's no longer specific to that neighborhood. We all know what you mean when you say that. I think what we don't realize is that we are being marketed to, and unbeknownst to us, we think what we like is the marketplace standard. We're trying to attach ourselves to that and think, oh, yes, of course I want a spa bathroom with all beige, everything. So, because I think that what I want is tranquility, and I think that that means those particular colors. But in fact, that's been put upon us by an industry that's trying to sell us things. Is that fair to say?
Well, so let's unpack that a little bit. The way that media does this or marketing does this is just as you described a little bit earlier, it makes us feel like we're not getting it right if we're not adhering to those standards,
Okay.
right? So take one of these typical shows. What you would see is a camera crew maybe go through a home and point out everything that is wrong with it.
Yes.
Right? Oh, I can't believe they would put that backsplash with that countertop. And look at those floors. Who would do that? And look at this paint color. It's terrible. And so what ends up happening is that people internalize those messages. And what that tells them is if I don't adhere to these standards, whatever they are, that spa-like bathroom, the industrial kitchen, if I'm not adhering to these, I'm not getting it right. And people are going to think less of me as a result of that.
Mhm. Mhm.
And I think what you'll often see in these templates as well is that once a family goes through those renovations, typically at the end, they have some sort of barbecue or family and friends come over, and there's a big celebration. right? Telling those homeowners, you got it right. Good for you. We're going to celebrate how well you've done. And so all of that gets internalized then for homeowners, and it really drives them to want to adhere to those standards that are set by the marketplace.
Yeah. I struggle with this a little bit. I'm always telling people with most of their questions, there is no right answer. And yet, there are some fundamental design principles that I
Right.
do believe in, that I do think work, that I do feel like change our homes in ways that most people want. For example, curtains that go all the way to the floor to elongate and raise the height of the ceiling.
Mhm.
So, is that wrong? If somebody has curtains that stop at the windowsill, is that just me saying, "Oh, this is what all of the professionals have said you should do," and yet, you shouldn't because who cares what they say?
Oh, you're actually
Yeah.
asking.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm asking you, like, is it okay to have some standards, but not all of them? And
I
still
think,
have a very personal home, I guess.
yeah, I think the way that we're talking about standards are slightly different.
Okay.
Right? And so the standards that I'm thinking about are less about those design principles and more perhaps about the aesthetics that the marketplace chooses. So is there a
Yeah,
right way or a wrong way to do it? I don't know, but certainly
right,
what the marketplace is telling you is that there is a marketplace right way to do things.
right. It is by necessity going to appeal to a large swath of people because the what they're trying to do is sell products. And so
Exactly.
therefore they want a wide net. So it
Yeah.
is in direct conflict with the homeowner's goal, which you would call emplacement. I just feel like it's really hard for people when they're in it to realize that, oh, the reason I might like that granite waterfall counter is because I've seen it a million times in design magazines, on Instagram. That must be the right way. And so therefore I must like it. How do we know? How do we pull apart? Well, what do
Yeah.
I like versus what are the trends?
And that's the really difficult thing to do, right? And so this is where working with someone such as yourself can be super helpful, right? In our research, what we really found was that people were trying to find ways to straddle the balance between adhering to the marketplace with how do I also bring my own identity in and
Yeah.
not compromise on making this a place that I feel at home.
Yeah.
So I'll give you a couple of examples. So one family, they had renovated their kitchen entirely to marketplace standards, but the thing she was really excited about was taking maps from family vacations and getting those framed and then hanging those canvases in this otherwise standardized
Mm,
open concept kitchen.
mm,
Another family, the home was renovated to marketplace standards. So think white gray walls, white quartz countertops, industrial stainless steel appliances. But the powder room was painted a bold reddish color. She put a stained glass in there. I'll give you yet another example in a kitchen where the kitchen had been renovated to the standards of the marketplace. Again, at this time it was shaker cabinets. They were gray, kind of a lighter gray countertop. But she had these custom made tiles delivered that she installed in the backsplash. And she was super excited about those tiles being one of a kind. They were only made for her. They were handmade and then had them installed behind her gas range. And so I'm talking now about nine by nine tiles, right? We're talking
yep.
about a very small
Small.
piece of customization in an otherwise standard kitchen.
Hmm.
But this is how people were adhering to the standards while also finding ways to personalize it. But, Zandra, it was often done in a way where it could be easily removed.
Yeah.
So that's how people were dealing with it.
Well, and tell us a little bit more about this woman with the tiles because in the paper you talk about she she was still struggling with a feeling of confidence over that choice.
So thanks for bringing that up. And that's what we really found was that as much as people felt uneasy about having their home overly standardized, if you will, they were equally uneasy about bringing too much personalization in. And really, the way that that manifested was just this going back and forth about, what do you think about this? And, I'm going to ask my sister-in-law, what does she think? And I'm asking all these other people, what do you think about these tiles? And so the way that we interpreted that was that's a really deep rooted fear of getting it wrong. And again, if we think back to those HGTV shows, we hear how people are, admonished when they get it wrong.
Yeah. We all have that experience of someone close to us, probably a family member who feels like they can say whatever they want.
Yeah.
And they come in and they have no problem saying, "Ugh, why did you pick that tile?"
Huh?
Without even realizing how damning that is to one's personal sense of self-expression. I don't think they mean to be harsh. They just don't have a filter because they're used to not having a filter around you, but because of their family. But I mean, that's a very personal attack almost.
And that's a really interesting point that you make. If we go back to understanding what does the home represent for us and what really culturally does a home mean to people, it is a reflection of our identities. And so when people say something about, oh, those tiles are terrible or that backsplash is awful, it cuts so deep because it feels like it's an attack on our own identity.
Yes. Yes.
I'll tell you something else that we haven't really talked about,
Okay,
right?
sure.
Which is that people are trying to adhere to these standards, but the thing is that these standards are constantly changing and shifting.
Exactly. I mean, I've just been reading in design magazines, gray kitchens are out, gray walls are out, I mean, that was the standard 10 years ago. So people really start to feel more and more anxious about every single choice they make because they know the trends are going to change.
And so I think what ends up happening is that if you're not in the throes of a renovation, you're perhaps already thinking about the next renovation.
Right. And I think that you start feeling that often enough when, oh, I made a change and now it's out of date. I made a change and now it's out of date. You're going to start to just clam up and not want to do anything, which is a shame, of course, because I think of our home as our biggest investment, but not just from a financial standpoint, but from an investment in one's personal development. And it was so interesting to me, kind of to bring it back to the beginning of our conversation, that that actually was more the purpose back in the 40s, 50s, 60s than it is today.
I think like if we think back to this idea of the home also now being thought of as a financial asset to be maximized,
Yeah,
also in itself shifts how people think about their homes, right? And
that's
so
true. Back then, that was like that was their home. They were going to live in there for forever. I mean, they weren't thinking about reselling.
absolutely. So that's the other thing that has changed, right? So historically, you would buy a house and you would tend to spend your life there.
Yeah,
Maybe change homes once, but now it's very unusual for people to live in the first home that they bought, right? And
yeah,
almost people buy a home with an eye of buying another one as soon as
right,
they can.
right. We have a starter home. I mean, there's a term for that.
Yeah, we have a
Yeah.
starter.
I want to talk about this issue of professionalization a little bit because I tend to focus on the professionalization of design and how to kind of walk that balance between trusting designers who are trained, who have all this experience, and one's own sense of aesthetic. In your work, you focus more on the professionalization of the contracting industry, for example, the building industry. How is that influencing people when they think about choices they're going to make?
Yeah, it's now a site almost for a professional. So let me unpack what that means.
Okay.
Take a look at the kitchen, for example, right? Like historically, you had home appliances, and today those home appliances are increasingly like restaurant style appliances.
Right.
Right. And so that's like the push toward what we would think of as professionalization. So it's not enough anymore to have, kind of like a stove in your house with those coil burners and an electric oven. People now have gas ranges that you would otherwise see in a restaurant with
Yeah.
a minimum of sort of 6 gas burners.
You see in real estate listings, comes with chef's kitchen.
Comes with chef's kitchen. And not only that, but what average homeowner actually knows how to use it on a
Well,
chef?
especially some of these are so complicated, these appliances. Yeah.
They're so complicated. And so what we were interested in was that sort of like push to professionalization, where now our kitchens look like restaurants. As we were kind of wrapping up this project, what was getting really interesting was to see the professionalization of laundry rooms,
Oh,
right? So remember sort of like post World War II, you may have a washer and a dryer tucked somewhere in the corner of the basement. And today, what's more typical is to have a dedicated, aesthetically pleasing place that houses laundry, the laundry machines, which are also much more industrial in
Right.
style.
Right.
And you have a room dedicated with dedicated hanging racks and a tuck away ironing board. And so what we really mean by the professionalization of the home is all of the equipment that it takes to
Mhm.
run what you would think of as like an industrial home. And so we were really seeing a push toward that, and that is also totally fascinating.
And I want to note here, there, if you really love to cook, I can see why you would want to have really high grade kitchen appliances. If you, I mean, I actually have been coveting a laundry room for a long time. I hate going to the basement. First of all, the ceiling's not that high. It's kind of dank. This is I live in an old home, so that it's a stone walled basement. It's not finished. So I get the desire for those things. I think you, I think it's an interesting term to call it the professionalization because I feel like, and you mentioned there's a nuance to this. I feel like what you're also saying is with professionalization comes this idea, subconscious or not, that there's a right way and a wrong way to do it because any profession has standards. And now
Yeah.
all of a sudden we have to live up to them. And you had a great example in the paper of somebody who was really nervous about the size of their island that they were choosing. Could you tell us that story?
Yeah, absolutely. So a couple of things, right? So on that point of professionalization, not only are you making sure that you adhere to standards that are determined by that profession, but you're also wanting to demonstrate your expertise. You're understanding that, hey, I have this gas range and I know how to use it. But, my
Right,
sister who comes over on the weekend to help with family dinner, oh, she doesn't know how to use it.
right.
So there is also this sort of thinking back to the home as a reflection of your identity. It's a way to kind of demonstrate that you not only know how to adhere to the standards, but you are adept at having this expertise that it takes to have this kind of professionalized home.
Interesting. So it's kind of an ego thing. I mean, are we really that petty?
I mean, I would think it goes back to thinking about the home as such an important site for an expression of our identities. Not only that, it boosts your most expensive financial asset in most cases.
Well, again, depending on how quickly you sell it. If you sell it 20 years later, everything that you spent all that money on is going to be out of date again.
So here's the other thing I wanted to share with you. In our research, what we found was that people would often make renovations with an eye to this is going to increase the value of my financial asset. But oftentimes we would ask them, do you have any plans to sell your home anytime soon? And very rarely did people have plans to sell their home. And in fact, it was often the opposite, where they would say, my parents are getting older. And so now it's really my home is becoming the site where the family meets.
Right.
Yeah, and so they were really kind of doubling down on this emplacement. Their home was really going to be a site for them and for their families, but in the back of their minds was the idea that I also want it to have a lot of value as a financial asset. And again, this is something that we see directly out of a home renovations media, right? So like
Hmm.
again, in a
Hmm.
typical show, they'll show you the home before it was renovated, then they'll show you the home renovated, and often there's a little tally at the corner of the screen saying how much they had spent, what the previous value was, and what the value now is.
Yes.
And often it's always like way more than what
Yes.
the family spent on the home. It reinforces this idea that maximizing your financial value is an important part of getting the home right.
Before I forget, I want to go back to that story about the
Sure.
contractor and the size of the island. Do you remember?
Yeah, so this was the family where she was agonizing over the size of the island, and she was tossing and turning in bed at night. That example, I think, it really emphasizes that anxiety that people feel about making sure that they get it right. And I don't want to belittle that because this is a huge investment,
Yeah.
and you do make a mistake where you don't like the size of the kitchen island, you're either going to have to live with it, or that's going to be thousands of dollars of a redo, and that can be really problematic.
Right.
um, but I think what home renovations media has done is it's heightened the pressure to make sure that you get it right,
Yeah.
and that anxiety really emerged in all of the people that we spoke with.
Right. No, that anxiety is real, and I don't take it lightly either. The thing about turning to an interior designer for their professional opinions is you really have to shop around and know what questions to ask in order to find one that's going to work with you. I get pitched all the time by interior designers to be guests on the show, and I have to tell you, there's a lot of, I would call it generic or mediocre design. You would call it market standard design because
Mm.
it really is all about stripping away anything that's personal and make it very much conforming to whatever is on trend. My thinking about how to deal with that is if you start with products, if you have a product-centered approach to solve your design dilemmas, then that's where you immediately go in the wrong direction. If you're
Mm.
not starting with your own vision of what you want and then looking for items that will enhance that vision or make that vision come to life, then you're going to basically be stuck with what's ever currently on trend because we are all so susceptible to saying, oh my gosh, I remember when fiddle leaf fig trees were all the rage. Everybody started buying fiddle leaf fig trees. Now they are really quite nice. It was hard to distinguish, well, do I like the fiddle leaf tree or is that just because I'm seeing it everywhere?
Yeah, and I think I want to go back to that point that you made about a product centric
Okay.
vision versus and what we would think of the opposite as is a consumer or a homeowner centric vision.
Okay.
And this is where a designer really can help because a designer can straddle those worlds between understanding the marketplace standards, but once they get to know their client, they can understand who their client is and what their identity is, and then really help them to bridge those two worlds so that the homeowner can feel good knowing, hey, I got it right. I adhered to these market standards, and also I'm not compromising who I am. And so my identity is also coming, through in this mix of marketplace and myself. And so that's what we found was that a designer can really help with that.
Yeah, the caveat is a really good designer. And I'm sorry to be so blunt here, but I think my audience appreciates that I can be honest about these things. Not all designers are created equal. And so you really have to be careful who you are getting that guidance from, or you are going to still end up with the cookie cutter generic home. I want to wrap up with a question about where you see us going. What do you think the next questions are that either you're really interested in asking or that we should maybe be asking as consumers going forward?
Yeah, I think a couple of things, and you're no stranger to this, but if we think about the trends and how things are shifting and changing, it feels like since this paper has been published, that there's been a big push against the sad and boring beige
Yeah,
in favor now of much bolder colors, more maximalism within the home. I think what's going to be interesting to see is does that actually help people to personalize anymore? Or is this becoming another standard that you follow? The other interesting thing going forward is this idea of professionalization and what does that look like? And so if you think historically, think back to that World War II home, where we were getting these ideas of professional standards was typically from home economics classes. So, balancing budgets, how to use a kitchen,
hmm,
and all the appliances and everything that you needed to go along with that. Fast
ironing,
forward,
taking care of clothes. Yeah,
all of that stuff, preserving food, food management within the home. And fast forward to today, and what we're seeing is that those standards now seem to be set by social media influencers.
hmm, yeah,
And so there's a much bigger, broader body of people that are setting those standards. And so what we're curious to know is how does that change both the standards and how does it change how we understand what authority is around who determines what professional standards are?
exactly.
And they have all of a constellation of products that go into that.
And what does it do to our understanding of home, which I think is where you started? What does home mean?
Yeah. So I think we've only just barely scratched the surface on this idea of the professionalization of the home.
Oh, this has been such a great conversation. Thank you so much. Would love to have you on again later after, after we've had a few more years to kind of digest all of this and see where society takes us.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for your interest in our research, and it's really been fun to talk with you.